On February 7th, 2017, the U.S. Senate debated the confirmation of Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama to become the Attorney General, and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts spoke against his confirmation, criticizing his record on civil rights. As part of her debate speech, Senator Warren quoted a letter from Coretta Scott King, and at this point, Senator Daines of Montana and the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell used a Senate rule to silence her. Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon subsequently, after Warren left the podium, subsequently read the letter from Scott King without objection. Following the Senate ruling to silence Senator Warren, Senator McConnell said on the Senate floor, Senator Warren was giving a lengthy speech. She had appeared to violate the rule. She was warned. She was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted. That phrase, nevertheless, she persisted, has since become a feminist rallying cry. I thought for a long time this week about whether or not to open with this story from our history, our political history, recognizing that we are a church that is not of one mind politically, and thank goodness we are not. We need diversity of all kinds to challenge one another and in order to grow in faith and service. But I decided to use the story not to elevate one party over another, but because the story so heartbreakingly demonstrates our divisions along lines of gender, race, and political allegiance. And because it is a story of a single woman in a male-dominated realm who stood up to authority and power and has, as a result, motivated other women to persist. This story about Elizabeth Warren mirrors in some ways our gospel story this morning. The gospel reading is a difficult story. On first reading, it seems to represent Jesus as uncaring, ethnocentric, and misogynistic. This story is so fraught that the lectionary actually offers preachers an alternative reading. But I think it's a great shame to skip this story because by ignoring it, ignoring the story of the Canaanite woman that persisted, we miss a transformational moment in Jesus's mission. This is the story of the powerful pairing of persistence and faith. Persistence in the face of opposition and faith that things can change. So let me recap the story with a little bit of added context. This woman is a Canaanite, and a Canaanite is a person from Palestine whose ancestors were ethnically cleansed from the land by order of the God of Israel in the Old Testament so that it could become the promised land for the Israelites. So many of the Canaanites were killed and some were enslaved. So in other words, Jesus and the disciples were seen by this woman as powerful colonizers. They were insiders and she was an outsider. She was indigenous but powerless. She greets him with the words, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David." And she was shouting. Just like today, shouting at a stranger on the street is highly unacceptable, or at that time was highly unacceptable, or highly suspect behavior associated with desperation or instability. So she's shouting, but she's shouting for mercy. She asked Jesus for mercy. In the ancient Middle East, mercy had a very particular meaning. Mercy was given to those with an interpersonal obligation. Let me repeat that. Mercy was given to those with an interpersonal obligation. For example, I can have mercy on someone that owes me money because she owes me something, right? I can extend mercy to that person. We have an interpersonal obligation. God can have mercy on us because he created us and is responsible for us. So there's both a relationship and an obligation between two people when mercy is extended. Calling for mercy and calling Jesus Son of David is a way of pointing out both the relationship and the obligation between Jesus and this unnamed woman. In other words, she might have said, hey, you are the colonizer of my people and you own me. We share a mutual history. Have mercy on me. And here's where the story gets really difficult. What is Jesus's response? He's silent, but she persists. And she persists in such a way that the disciples get really uncomfortable. They say to Jesus, please send her away. She keeps shouting at us. So then Jesus answers her. He says, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, I don't owe you anything. You're not my people. But again, she persists, this time kneeling before him. And I imagine her with empty hands thrust out in front of her saying, Lord, help me, have mercy on me. And his answer, it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Despite the brutality of this statement, her retort is brilliant. She says, yes, that's true. She recognizes that in the tribal Middle East, that anyone's primary obligation would be to their tribe. But she also recognizes that there is enough to go around, enough to heal her daughter. She knows about Jesus. She has heard of his miracles. Perhaps she had heard of the feeding of the 5,000. She likely knows that he had healed countless people. She's not asking for a special seat at the table. She's not asking to displace anyone or take anything away from someone else. She says, yes, Lord, that's true. But even the dogs eat from the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Her answer to Jesus is a testimony to the abundance of the kingdom of God. And Jesus recognizes that it comes from a place of deep faith, deep fidelity. And he says, great is your faith. And her daughter is healed. I love that line, great is your faith, because if you read the stories around this story with the disciples, he keeps telling them, oh, you of little faith. He's calling his disciples men of little faith, and yet the stranger woman, unnamed, has great faith. This is such a difficult yet beautiful passage. And as I was studying commentaries to prepare for this week, I listened to a reflection by Dr. Joy Moore, an African-American scholar. And she said that this is a particularly hard passage for her as a Black woman to, in her words, read Jesus as a screw-up. And his seemingly sexist, ethnocentrist, classist behavior in the story, she says, is a screw-up. Where, she asks, is the lordship in this? And how can Jesus need a woman of color to tell him that she is created in the image of the God he claims to be the son of? But Dr. Moore explains that she doesn't believe that Jesus's behavior is a reflection of his heart, rather that he is reflecting what is in the disciples' hearts. He is acting out their cultural bias. So this exchange is a healing moment for the disciples, just as much as it is for the Canaanite woman and her daughter. Jesus, in his rude silence and rude answer, is giving voice to the cultural view of this woman. And the Canaanite woman gets it when she answers yes. But she also knows that the abundance that Jesus has demonstrated is a blessing to all. So while I don't think that Jesus is calling her a dog, I do want to suggest that this encounter changes his ministry and his mission. After this point, Jesus begins to reach out to outsiders where he hadn't before. So is it possible that a woman of color had such a significant influence on Christianity? I think it's possible that without her persistence, that Jesus's ministry would have been limited to his own tribe. He might not have reached out to anyone except for fellow Israelites. I believe that this persistent woman was an important part of God's perfect plan for all of us. Now I want to tell you another story of a woman that has nevertheless persisted. Drusilla was born in Guatemala, but has lived in the United States for the past 5 years. She has a daughter who is 2.5, and her name is Jessie. And Jessie is a US citizen. As of July 29th, 2020, just a few, 2 weeks ago, Drusilla and her daughter have been living in the sanctuary apartment in First Congregational Church, while Drusilla seeks protection and safety in the United States. In May of 2019, following a long process of congregational education and discernment, the First Congregational Church of Ithaca, their membership voted to become a sanctuary church. In that role, they pledged to provide shelter as needed for an undocumented immigrant who is seeking sanctuary, while legal challenges to deportation are in process. The membership and the faith groups in the Ithaca Sanctuary Alliance have committed to providing support through material means, fellowship, and prayer. As Reverend David Caden has said, engaging in the sanctuary process is a statement of extravagant welcome for at-risk members of our community, modeled on the principle of God's unconditional grace offered to all. I don't know anything else about Drusilla's story, but I imagine that she, like the Canaanite woman, is someone of great faith, great persistence, and that she sees the abundance of the United States and recognizes how this abundance can be a blessing to all the nations. Guatemala is a country with high rates of poverty, crime, drug trade, and instability. People who live there have a very short life expectancy. They have very low literacy and education rates. Like the Canaanite woman and all mothers everywhere, I am sure that Drusilla wants what is best for her daughter, who is a US citizen. So how does the story of the Canaanite woman shape our reaction to Drusilla and her daughter? How do both of these stories point out our own biases? How should we respond to this request for sanctuary? Should we ignore Drusilla or keep silent? Do we use racial slurs to refer to her and her daughter? Of course not. Do we want someone to tell them to go away? Or can we trust that there is enough for everyone? Do we trust God's promise of abundance? The story of the dogs eating the scraps from the table reminds me of a couple weeks ago. We had one of Sam's friends over for dinner, and Sam made meatball sandwiches. And this poor friend was doing his best to eat his messy meatball sandwich with a knife and fork, and no less than 2.5 meatballs hit the floor. And guess who was there to snap them right up but our good old dog, Maggie. And it was the best day ever for her. And I just had to laugh about that story, that the scraps that fall from the American table, they are pretty rich if they are 2.5 meatballs. Anyway, this kid is Maggie's best friend now. So right now we are in a moment as a church that we are being called on to share the crumbs from the Master's table with this mother and daughter who are seeking sanctuary, community, social healing, and home. Our church needs to engage in a discernment and decision-making process about whether or not to join the Ithaca Sanctuary Alliance. If we join, we will be asked to support the sanctuary guests with prayer, gifts of time, friendship, and money. Typical forms of support for guests will be picking up and dropping off groceries, dropping off library books, practicing English either on Zoom or socially distanced in person, and donations are also being accepted for the daughter's community nursery school tuition. We might decide as a church to formally support them with our time, talents, and resources. we might decide to stand next to First Congregational Church at press conferences to announce when new sanctuary residents arrive. But it's time for us to start a deeper conversation about sanctuary, about this radical hospitality, and to make these decisions. I want to suggest that this conversation is important, not just because we have an abundance to share, but it's because we need to recognize our own neediness. Our problem in the affluent West is that we are so busy, so self-sufficient, so addicted to work, achievement, or pleasure that we fail to recognize our own need for mercy. We think we're sitting at the table until we find ourselves on the outside, either emotionally, physically, economically, or spiritually. As I said in the children's sermon, St. Augustine said that God always wants to give us good things, but our hands are too full to receive them. So as we approach the question of whether or not we should serve as part of the sanctuary community, now hosting Drusilla and her daughter, let us approach this question with humility. Will we decide that we already have our hands full? Will it be one more thing that we try to juggle with our full hands? Or can this service be one of the good things that we receive from God out of God's abundance? Can we learn to serve, not out of our own strength, but with empty hands? This story of the unnamed indigenous woman of color from the Bible is one of my favorites, perhaps because I was not much of an insider growing up. I'm sure you can imagine a smart girl who speaks her mind and is a foot taller than everyone else. It's not really a recipe for popularity. But this woman offers us a beautiful model of biblical womanhood. She shouts, she's smart, she stands up to power, and she persists. But she does so because she recognizes her relationship to the Lord, the Son of David, and she sees the abundance of his kingdom and recognizes her desperate need for mercy. Jesus proclaims her faith great, and she changes the course of history. This story is good news for me because even though I consider myself one of the extremely fortunate in the world, I am still in need, desperate need of mercy. So persist, yes, but let's do it with empty hands, trusting God to give us every good thing. He is faithful to do it. And that's the good news of the gospel.